Rick is area manager in Vicar, Luberzall, Louisville. Rick and I met a little while back, and appreciating a lot what the men in uniform do for our country. And I didn't get to serve in the military, but senior in high school, I had a bad car accident and actually thought about going in the military, wanted to, but I know you and Mike have both served time in our military and served our country. And I just, your service for the military, first of all, on your own, and then just the love that you had for veterans, I picked up on that really quick. Men and women that are in uniform and people that you had interviewed and people from World War II. And Rick, tell us a little bit about yourself and about, you've written a book as well on veterans, and I want our listeners to hear a little bit about that. So if you just give us a little background on that, I'd sure appreciate it.
Sure, Travis. I'm an Army veteran, and I'm originally from Chicago. I'll give you a little bit of personal background.
Yes, sir.
One of four children, and I was fortunate enough to, my experience and love for veterans actually stems back to my father, who was a World War I vet, a World War II vet who went in underaged. We're still actually, ironically, doing some research on him. My father was probably either 14 or 15 when he went into World War II.
No kidding.
That is correct.
Now, what branch did he serve, brother?
He actually served in the Navy in World War II. He went in 1942, and I think it was 13 years he served in the Navy, and then he did a stint of 3 years in the Army during the Korean War and post-Korean War era.
Wow! So you grew up as a military kid. You grew up in a serviceman's house.
Yeah, I kind of did.
What was that like, Rick?
Well, it was unique in the sense that there was certainly discipline that he taught us. There were 3 boys, and then we had a sister. And what kind of amazed me is I remember just as a kid of about 8 or 9, sitting and playing in my parents' closet and seeing his Navy uniform. And there was something about that resonated with me back then. So, it was discipline, but it was for the better. Obviously, I didn't grow to appreciate that until I got much older and became an adult and eventually a parent as well.
Yes, sir. It's funny how those childhood lessons come back when you get older. And that I tell my dad all the time, I said, Dad, you get smarter every year I live. all those lessons, all those things you taught me, they make more and more sense all the time. Well, that's neat. And so you developed a love for the military, I guess, while you were in the military, or when do you think that? You said because of your dad. Tell us a little bit about that. What kind of made that burnt that flame in you about veterans learning from your dad?
Well, it was that part, Travis, and then when I went to college, I originally went to University of Alabama. I was pursuing sports at that time, and suffered.
What sport did you play?
I played for a short time as a walk-on in football.
Okay.
And sustained injuries. It was kind of difficult going to a school of that caliber as a walk-on. And so I kind of given up that pursuit, and I was looking for something else to do. And my father, ironically, asked me, had you ever thought about going in the military? And at that time, my original thought was no, I hadn't. But the more I sat down and thought about it and thought about esprit de corps and discipline and all the attributes that the service brings, it seemed like a good fit. So that's how I ended up getting in there. But all along, my interest had always been in World War II, and I would watch certain things on television, on the History Channel, and somewhere later in my life, actually post-military, I was watching something on the History Channel, and it was like a light bulb went off and said, you watch this stuff all the time on TV. Why don't you just record history yourself? So there were a couples of World War II veterans that actually went to our church, and my original plan was just to interview them. And then I had a neighbor down the street, and my father was still alive at the time, and I was just going to do a small tribute, a small paper. And as things grew, people started feeding me more information. So I started from right at my local church to across the county, then across the state, and then across the country.
Wow. So that really blossomed from something small into something pretty big after a while. That's pretty neat, brother. And Rick, what's the name of your book, too?
The title of my book is called Tribute to Valor and Courage.
Tribute to Valor and Courage, okay.
Yes.
And can you find that on Amazon?
It is on Amazon, and I think you can find them at Joseph Beth bookstores as well. There's one in Lexington, and I think one in the Cincinnati area, and one in Northern Kentucky.
Okay, fantastic. And Mike, you got any questions?
No, keep going, brother. You're fine.
Okay. One of the things, Rick, I know you had said that you told us earlier that you'd brought some pictures, and we've got video also of what we're doing today, and I'd sure like to get some of that on video. We got the camera aimed towards you there, but if you could talk us through some of those, I'd sure appreciate it. And just some of what you've got there in your lab.
Okay, let me pick out a few.
Sure.
Which way is best to turn the video?
It's right there.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So the first one I want to highlight is this gentleman here. This is Frank Woodruff Buckles.
Okay.
Mr. Buckles was the last known living American World War I veteran.
Wow.
So when I heard about him, I was doing some work and research on World War II vets, and a friend of mine asked me, had you ever thought about interviewing the World War I vet? And frankly, I thought he was a little off of his rocker. I didn't know that there were any still left.
I didn't know either.
But
how long ago was that, Rick?
This was 2009, I think, when I first interviewed him.
Wow.
And so I went home and did some research, and sure enough, I found that there was a Mr. Frank Buckles who was still living. And I said, well, how in the world am I going to be able to even make contact with this guy? I don't know him from anybody. So I got on the internet and I started researching, and I found a gentleman in Michigan who was doing photography of statesmen, and he had taken an interest in Mr. Buckles. So I told him my story, and I told him I was a vet and my father was a vet and what I was looking to do. And he said, well, I'll give you his daughter's number, and the worst thing she could do was say no. And I said, sure. So I called her up, and as Providence would have it, and doors opening, I called her up and asked her if I could interview her father, and she said, you may not believe this, but he doesn't have anything going on. Now, what made that so important was this was around a Memorial Day weekend.
Wow.
So for those who are veterans know that along with Veterans Day are usually two important days for us. And,
absolutely.
And this gentleman was usually always with some congressman. He had pictures with the president. And I said, I'll be on my way. So I actually drove up to Washington, D.C. to interview some Japanese-American World War II veterans. And then I drove over to Mr. Buckles' farm. And he and his daughter, Susanna, were running a 330-acre farm in a place called Charlestown, not to be confused with Charleston, in West Virginia. So I drove over to his house, and I met his daughter, and I asked her, I said, well, how can I talk to him? And she said, just talk to him like you're talking to me. And so we started out a conversation and found out he drove the family tractor until he was, I think, 103, 104 years old.
My goodness.
And he was sort of fussing that he could still drive it, and Susanna was behind him, raising his hand in the air, saying like, "Oh no, he can't do this." But mind you, at the time I was talking to Mr. Buckles, I think he was 108 then.
Wow,
that's amazing.
So,
and how long did he live? Rick? Were you able to keep up with him at all? Or?
Yes. So we finished the interview, and I was just stunned after the interview and going home, but. To kind of share a little bit of his background.
Yeah, please.
He was in World War I. He didn't like to use the word lied. He said he fudged his age, so he got in at 16 on his third try. Made it into World War I. Wanted to get overseas as fast as he could, so he went to a casualty care unit, and there he took care of some casualties. They transported some POWs, I think, and some dignitaries. So he made it from England to mainland Europe, finished that, made it through World War One, came back home on the Carpathia, and the Carpathia was one of the ships that rescued people from the Titanic.
I remember hearing the name of that ship.
Yeah, so he was on the Carpathia coming home. Came home, said he wanted to see the world, so ironically, in 1941, he's in Manila in the Philippines, so he'd become a purser on a ship. And unfortunately, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they went across the international date line and attacked the Philippines. So Mr. Buckles, after having made it through World War I, gets captured as a civilian prisoner in World War II. Now, if you do the math, he's no spring chicken. He's 40 years old. And Mr. Buckles was in captivity, I think he told me, for 3 years.
As a civilian now. So.
As a civilian.
Yeah, that's something.
And he was about 5'9". He weighed 155 pounds. He said when he first started weighing himself, when he dropped below 100, he stopped weighing himself in captivity. When they were liberated by, I believe it was the 44th Tank Battalion, they were living on a handful of rice a day. So he survived, where a lot of younger soldiers that were in some of the other camps had actually passed away, just didn't make it through. Although he didn't have to go on the death march, he did survive. So he came back home, went to California, met his eventual wife. They moved to West Virginia, which he said was the land of his forefathers. His great, and maybe one more great grandfather was in the Battle of Oriskany in the Revolutionary War. Wow. So that's where he settled down and stayed married to his wife until she passed away. I think she was 91. And Mr. Buckles said he thought he lived to be 120. Well, he actually lived 2 more years. He lived to be 110. And what happened is pneumonia actually got him, and that's how he ended up passing away. But his mind was so sharp, and he just enjoyed people. If you ever looked on his website, there would be Girl Scouts that would come by, and there would be motorcycle clubs, and he just loved entertaining people and just still felt some relevancy in life. And if you can imagine going from a time when the Wright brothers hadn't even flown a plane yet to the time of laptops, you know, what a migration through life.
Wow, I mean, he saw some things, didn't he? That's a neat story.
Absolutely. Another I'll share with you here is
Sure.
A lady who actually was a prisoner of war in World War II. It's very unique. Her name was Mildred Dalton Manning, and Miss Manning was one of several nurses that were actually in the Philippines. So there were, I believe, 88 nurses that were in the Philippines, 11 from the Navy and 77 from the Army that were there during the time of the Japanese attack. Some of them got out by sub with General MacArthur. A few people got out via plane. A couple got out by ship, but Miss Manning was unfortunate enough to not to get away. So she was a prisoner for about 3 years, and in addition to being sick herself, she took care of people because she was a nurse. And it seems like Miss Manning told me she had something like 10 different diseases at one point in time. Dysentery, beriberi, dengue fever, malaria, among some others. And yet and still she was able to survive and take care of patients. So fortunately, all of the nurses that were there were not accosted or assaulted by any of the other soldiers, which was definitely a point of concern. And so she made it back home to the U.S., and she sold war bonds for the duration of war after she was liberated. A really sweet lady. She actually was the only one that I didn't interview in person, but I've got 2 or 3 handwritten letters from her in absolutely perfect cursive writing, just unbelievable. And when I finished with her we exchanged a few letters. We finished with her interview, and before I got the book out, unfortunately, she passed away. But I had, unbeknownst to her son, I had interviewed her, so they lived up in New Jersey, and I called him one day, and I told him about the story that I interviewed his wife, and he said, one day we're going to have to get together, and I said, I'll get you a copy of the book. And so it's probably been close to 6 or 7 years ago now. I was at a book fair and a book conference in Nashville, Tennessee, and I thought about leaving a little early from the conference, but I had this unction just to hang around, and I said, I think I'm going to stay a little while longer. And so I was talking to a gentleman from Chicago, which is my hometown, and he was talking about his wife, who was an award-winning, I think, poet. And so this lady walks up to my book display, and she picks up a book. And she's kind of talking aloud, but yet still she's kind of talking to herself. And she says, World War II, huh? She said, I had a mother-in-law who's in World War II. And I was kind of listening out of, corner of my, out of one ear, and said, okay, that's not unusual. And she said, and my mother was a nurse in World War II. And again, not unusual. A lot of women were nurses. And then she said, her nickname was, they called her Millie. And when she said that, I didn't hear another word that this man said. So the ironic or providential moment there was that the lady who is in my book and whose picture I'm holding was her mother-in-law. Wow. So let me paint the picture for you on how this meeting occurred. So this lady lives in New Jersey. She is a writer. I never talked to her. I only talked to her husband, whose mother is on this picture. And when I told her that, it was like she seen a ghost. It was like the blood started draining out of her face. She said, oh my God, I got to go get my husband. So she tried to get him on the cell phone, couldn't get him. Sort of had a few choice words. Eventually she goes back and gets her husband, brings him over, and this is how we meet. So when we started talking about things, she said, you know what, I had thought about leaving early, but I just had this feeling that I need to stay around, and there was something that I needed to do. Wow. So we take a picture on Facebook, and one of them is holding a photo of his mom and the other one's holding the book, and she goes and gets all of her friends, and they come over to the site. And she's just elated, and her and her husband, and they share the story. But we had never met each other before, so you can't put that together mathematically for something like that to occur.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's a divine appointment, brother.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
The next gentleman I've got here is Buddy Branch, and Buddy Branch was in a segregated tank battalion. And he fought for General Patton during World War II. And I met him at a reunion they were having in Chicago. I was at home visiting some relatives. So I went down there, and I walked up to this distinguished looking gentleman on a cane, and sort of like almost like a naive little kid, I asked him, well, what did you do during the war? And it's typical with a lot of them. They said, oh, I didn't do very much. I just kind of did my part. And so after we exchanged pleasantries, I talked with he and his wife and his daughter, and I went over to another group of men, and they said, do you know who that was? And I said, no, nothing other than him introducing himself. They said, that was Mr. Branch. He won the Bronze Star for Valor in a battle in France, in a tank battle. Wow. So the irony again of this, of providence, of the divine appointment, was that I had actually read his story, his Army citation, in a book in a library in the little small town that I live in right now. Oh my goodness. And so it took me about a year or so to finally get him to sit down and let me do his interview. He's very modest. I said, look, Mr. Branch, you're not bragging about what you've done. I've already seen your citation. The Army gave you that. I just want you to tell me what happened and give me your rendition of it. So I finally got him to open up. I went to his home. He lived in Dayton. and we're sitting down and we're going through his photo album, and he turns a few pages and turns to this distinguished looking gentleman in uniform, and I was looking at his face and I thought, boy, that guy looks familiar to me. I know I've seen his face before. And then he turns a few more pages, and this gentleman's in a baseball uniform, and then it all clicked. So his platoon leader for a while had been John Roosevelt Robinson. Unbeknownst to us in baseball lore, is Jackie Robinson.
Oh, kid.
So he shared with me and had a picture of Jackie Robinson in his lieutenant's uniform. And he and Jackie served together stateside. And then we
I didn't realize Jackie Robinson was in the military. I didn't know that.
Jackie Robinson started out as, I think he was a cavalryman at Fort Riley, Kansas. And then ended up going to the tank battalion as a tanker. And then the other picture had Jackie Robinson's nephew, or Mr. Branch's nephew, on Jackie Robinson's shoulders after he had integrated baseball. And this was at a game, I think in Crosley Field in the 1950s, something like that. Just amazing.
That's neat. That's really neat.
And I'll just share a couple more with you.
No, take your time.
Okay, this is one of a Jewish couple.
Okay.
This is Miss Ann and Mr. Sandar Klein. This is their high school sweetheart picture. So the Kleins were from Ager, Hungary, and Hungary was the last country that the Nazis took over. And so Ann and Sandy grew up together, basically playing in the sandbox.
Wow.
And in 1930, I want to say 38, he joined the Army Air Corps after coming to the States. He had a father who was on the JAG Corps in the U.S. Army, so he comes and actually becomes a fighter for America. In the meantime, Ann stays behind, and she gets captured.
Now, what's the JAG Corps for those of us that
I'm sorry,
don't know?
Judge Advocate General.
Okay.
It's basically the legal corps
Gotcha. Okay.
of the Army wing. Yeah, thank you for
No.
asking me that.
I'm just not as versed, and I know we'll have some listeners that won't be, and I want them to understand what you're talking about. That's that. You don't realize sometimes that the military has all the different, just like the Surgeons General.
Absolutely.
And they've got all these different variations and things that they have to do to conduct. What they do throughout the world, and you don't realize that they're, just services that are just like our everyday services that they have to conduct. They have to feed people. They have judicial stuff going on. They have to build roads. They have to all that stuff. So no, I'm glad you mentioned that, brother. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Sure, no, but thank you for interjecting there. But while Sandy was flying as a radio man on aircraft, I don't know my aircraft too well, but it was either a B-17 or B-24, and was captured, and she ended up going to Auschwitz.
Oh, wow.
So while he's fighting for America in parallel, she's essentially going through hell on earth, and she told me a part about where she was in line with her parents, and Joseph Mengele, who they call the Angel of Death, that did all these hideous experiments on the Jews, was at the front of the line. Wow. And if Joseph Mengele thought you were deemed fit to live, you went one direction. If you weren't, you were sent the other way to the gas chambers.
My
so
goodness.
She was in line with her parents, and she said she remembers looking back the last time, and that's the last time she ever saw her parents. She saw her mother, and they were both sent to the gas chambers. Both of his parents, both of Sandy's parents were sent to the gas chambers. She had two brothers, George and Andrew, that were sent to a German work camp, and she never saw them again. But she was one of the sweetest ladies that you could ever meet. In fact, she lived in Louisville, or they did at the time. And we would talk for a while, and she would go get us something to eat, and then we'd talk a little longer, and she'd get us something to drink. And I said, look, Miss Klein, you got this backwards. You're not here to serve me. I'm here to serve you. But it was the heart of something like that that makes me think still that when I go through my toughest times, it only pales in comparison to what some of those people went through. So,
wow.
Both
her parents went to the gas chamber?
Both of her parents and both of his parents went to the gas chambers.
Goodness.
So she was fortunate enough to get a job in the kitchen, and so she was able to trade food for some of the amenities and some of the things we take for granted, shoes, socks, that sort of thing. And I asked her if she thought she would die. She said no, she always thought she would live. So she had banded with a group of ladies, and they just kind of took care of each other and picked lice out of their hair and did all the other things to encourage each other. So the happy ending, if you will, was that Anne survived. So after the war was over, Sandy went back to Budapest, found out that Anne was alive. He went back and found her, asked her to marry him, and she said yes. So they stayed married for 60 some odd years until Anne passed away. It may have been 70. She passed away at 91. And then Sandy just passed away about 5 years ago at almost 97.
Wow.
So another great couple.
So had childhood sweethearts and then had all that in common going through the war too.
Absolutely. I have a picture in my book where they were in a play together. She was in 3rd grade and he was in 4th grade. So they literally knew each other for 8 decades.
Yeah, that's wow, what a story. Man, you told me, it's just some of the stuff we watch in movies that are based on true life stories would pale in comparison to some of these stories. I mean, that's something somebody should make a movie about.
It's funny you say that, Travis. Almost everybody has said that, even especially some of the ladies love the part about them getting back together, getting married, having a family. He ended up getting a doctorate degree, became a psychiatrist, and so things really boded well for them.
Wow.
This next gentleman was in the 101st Airborne, where I was privileged to serve. This gentleman here, and he had a pretty interesting career, Mr. Flores. So again, I went to a reunion for the 501st Parachute Infantry regiment that was part of the 101st. They had a reunion in Louisville several years ago, and I wanted to meet some of the veterans because that's obviously part of my lineage, as I was fortunate enough to be in the 101st. And so I asked one of the gentlemen, could I meet some of the vets? And he said, yeah. He said, what do you want him at? So I said, how about a couch over there? And the guy motioned, and these veterans would come along. They sit down and talk with me for a certain amount of time, and then he kind of motioned for them that was enough, and they get up and leave. And then other people would come, and I kept trying to ask this guy what he had done, and he would never divulge or share what he'd done. Obviously, he had a lot of influence over them, and they respected him a whole lot. But he never tried to bring any attention to himself. And then I saw one gentleman that had his uniform on, his World War II uniform on. He was 87 at the time, and I said, hey, could I interview you, Mr. Flores? And he said, no, man. He said, I'm dancing with my wife. So he spent the rest of his evening dancing and flirting with his wife. And so I asked him, I said, could I come to your house maybe and interview you sometime? And he said, sure. He said, come on up to my house. So I was going to his house on a Thursday, but I had to reschedule till Friday because the city was renaming a street after him. And so I went up on a Saturday, and I got there a little late, so I was going to take he and his wife out to dinner, and he said, your money's no good. He said, I'll take you out to dinner. So we go into an Italian restaurant, and people stand up and they start clapping when we go into this restaurant. And I'm thinking, I don't know who these people are, but I'm probably way over my head. So we sit down and we have lunch, and then we go back to his house, and he's got a photo album too, like Mr. Branch, and we're looking through it. And the first picture that caught my attention was he had a picture with President George Bush, the elder President Bush, who was a Navy pilot in World War II, and a lot of people don't know that. He was one of the youngest, if not the youngest, Navy pilot in World War II. He was only 19 years old. And so we turned a few more pages, and then he's got a picture with the Queen of Belgium, because he was invited back to Bastogne for the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Bastogne, where the 101st was involved in a big skirmish there. Then he turns a few more pages, and he's got a picture with General Petraeus, who was a 4-star general who had been over the 101st and then Special Operations, and then he may have been over the CIA at one time. And so I asked him, I said, Mr. Branch, what did you think about the movies about World War II? And he said they were pretty interesting. And I said, well, what did you think about the movie Saving Private Ryan? And he said, now, that movie there, that wasn't too bad. He said, you know, I served with the real Private Ryan, don't you?
Is that right?
And I said, no, sir. He said, yeah, we used to call him Fritz Nealon. So after we finished our interview and I drove back to Kentucky, I got on the internet, and sure enough, I looked up Frederick Fritz Nealon and Googled him, and Mr. Nealon was from Tonawanda, New York, and he had 3 other brothers. I think 2 of them had gotten killed, and the third one they thought had gotten killed, but he actually was, I think, a Japanese POW. So, you know, of course, when they make movies, sometimes things may be glamorized a little bit, but the essence of the story was right there.
Wow.
And so,
so he confirmed that movie was at least somewhat close.
Yes,
wow.
the authenticity was there.
Well, that's good.
And so the hotel company, he was in hotel company 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. They go in to get him out. They, again, didn't have to go through all the fanfare that the movie depicted, but they went in and got him out, sent him back home, and he finished the rest of his tour instead of a parachute infantryman as an MP in Tonawanda, New York. Wow. And then he turns a few more pages, and towards the end of his photo album, he's got a picture of, if you all remember one scene where the gentleman was age progressed, and he was looking at the headstone, then he turned and looked at his wife and said, tell me I was a good man. And he's got a picture of that gentleman also in his photo album. So it kind of confirmed and validated all of the stuff that he went through.
Wow, that's neat.
That's cool.
Let me just pick out a couple more here. I was going to see if
how many you want, man.
I was going to say one thing while you're looking.
Yeah, go ahead,
Rick.
Mike.
It's neat that you can shed so much light on the details. You know, just these little things that really on the news. On the news, you don't get a lot of detail like we're hearing today, right? And just going in their homes like that, them inviting you in their home, and just going through the photo album, and now here you are seeing all these other people. You got to be kidding me, you know? So I think it's real special that you did that and had the opportunity, and now you're sharing it with us. We so much appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really is. It's an honor.
I feel like, Rick, I feel like your interviews with these people were a lot like the people you interviewed. I think you've got some hidden gems that a lot of people don't even realize are there.
Absolutely.
That are waiting to be discovered. That's some amazing information.
Yeah, and I thought I had a picture of my father here, but I may have left his at home. But I will share a couple of more of these.
Sure.
So we were talking about Gatlinburg earlier, and I remember being at the Gatlinburg parade. They actually have the first parade in the nation right after midnight on the 4th of July. And I saw a distinguished gentleman in his uniform. And I told my oldest daughter, I said, that guy was in World War II. And she said, well, how do you know that, Dad? I said, I can tell by looking at his uniform. And fortunately, I was able to find out who this gentleman was through another Cherokee Indian, who this gentleman also, his heritage was Cherokee Indian. And the other guy that had been around Vietnam time frame, he was a little older than me, but again, he had been in the 101st, and we became friends. So he got me introduced to this gentleman, and I found out who this gentleman was, and his name was Robert Youngdeer. So Robert Youngdeer was a Marine who actually was in this group called the Edson's Raiders.
And which one was he in the picture there?
He is this gentleman right
on
here.
On the right. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And the Edson Raiders were a specialized group in guerrilla warfare, and he had been in the Battle of Guadalcanal. Well, Mr. Youngdeer was while he was in the Battle of Guadalcanal, they had the battle on Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, and he actually got shot through the face and the neck by a sniper while he was trying to help some of his other friends that were pinned down. They were trying to recover some bodies. Well, Mr. Young Deer almost bled out at that point, but he was fortunate enough to make it back to the rear, and they actually got him on a hospital ship and treated him. So he was fortunate enough to survive. And while he's on the hospital ship, he met his older brother, who was also a Cherokee with another group there. He was a parachutist with the Marines, and he had gotten injured. So they didn't know that they were actually on the same island together, essentially. And they ended up both being injured and being together again on the hospital ship.
Wow.
So Mr. Young Deer was fortunate enough to survive that. He ended up getting out of the Corps. And after getting out of the Corps, he discovered he missed just the military life and discipline and some of the other things that being able to travel, some things he was afforded. So he actually ended up going back in the military, and he joined the 101st Airborne Division as a parachutist as well, and ended up serving in different areas. So he actually served for 20 years in the military, retired from the military, started working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, worked there for several years, retired from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he went back home and became the principal chief of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Tribe.
Wow.
So Mr. Young Deer was a man whose faith was extremely important to him, and he just passed away a few years ago. So I was fortunate enough to go to his house and spend time with he and his wife. At the time I interviewed them, I think they had been married 73 years.
Oh, my goodness.
And do you know how old he was at his death, Rick?
He was, I think he was 96.
Wow.
Mr. Young Deer.
Man, what a life.
Yep.
That's amazing.
And then the last one I will share here is a gentleman that was in what was called the Bataan Death March. So his name was Dr. Brown, Dr. Albert Brown.
And on the
He is the gentleman here to this side. He kind of looks a little bit like Clark Gable, sort of a handsome-looking guy.
Yeah.
And I saw his an article about him in the newspaper at home, and I told my wife, I said, I think I'm gonna go and see if I can find this guy. So I lived in Kentucky. He was supposedly alive in Illinois. I had been in Illinois, so I just got in my car. My wife said, okay. I got in my car and I drove all the way to southern Illinois.
That's neat, man.
And I went to the local VFW there and asked if there was an Albert Brown who was still alive and living here. And they said, oh, yeah, you're talking about old man Brown. Doc Brown said, yeah, he lives down the street with his daughter. So I go over to the house and his daughter Peg answers the door. Peg at the time I think was maybe 83, and she was taking care of him. She was running a bed and breakfast, and then she also had horses.
Pretty light schedule.
In her spare time.
Yeah. So again, another one of those things. When I think about I'm overworked, or I got too much going on. They really have taken a lot of excuses away in my life. And I kind of told her who I was and what my project was, and she said, "Let me see what I can do. Let me see if I can wake him up." So she went into the bedroom, tried to wake him up. He wasn't feeling well, and I said, "That's okay." I said, "If I could just shake his hand and tell him thank you for your service, I'll be on my way." And the doorbell rang, and a couple of customers came into the bed and breakfast, and Dr. Brown opened his eyes, and he started talking. So I had my tape recorder there just to record the different stories. And Mr. Brown was born in, I think it was 1905 or 1906. He says he remembers sitting in his godfather's lap in North Platte, Nebraska, and his godfather was William Buffalo Bill Cody.
Wow.
And they actually had a picture of Buffalo Bill Cody in the bed and breakfast at that place.
That's something. I've going out west. I've been to Scouts Rest before, with Buffalo Bill's, ranch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's something. Go ahead. I want to hear more
That's,
about it.
yeah, and fascinating guy, very eccentric, like to do different things. So Mr. Brown played basketball and ran track, and maybe even played football. But I know he did basketball and track at Creighton University in the 1920s.
Wow.
And he'd also played. There was a picture where he had played against the Harlem Globetrotters. He had his pilot's license. He actually ended up getting a license as a dentist. So he got drafted and ended up going to the Philippines. And unfortunately for him, he got trapped up after the Japanese had attacked and went on the Bataan Death March. And so Dr. Brown said when he was on the death march, I guess apparently he wasn't moving at a fast enough pace. So the Japanese stabbed him in the rear end and told him Speedo, which meant, you better get going. And he said that was the only time that I was at the back of the line. Again, I learned how to keep the pace. So he went through the Bataan Death March. They broke his back and his neck with a rifle butt. So he laid on the floor, he said, in one of the prison camps without any kind of medical treatment in Cabanatuan. He survived those death camps. They sent him on what they called the Hell Ship, which was essentially where they would take all of these POWs, just load them into the base of the ship, sort of like a slave ship, and they would just pour water down there or lower a bucket with food in it, take waste back up and that sort of thing, but they were all encapsulated in this hole. And he said sometimes people would actually die, and it was so crowded that they would be upright. They basically couldn't fall down and die. So he made it through that, went all the way to Japan. He worked in slave labor in Japan. He temporarily went blind while he was over in Japan. And but he actually made it through all of this. And he came back home once he was liberated, and he was in such bad shape. He said the doctors at what was then Fitzsimmons Hospital in Colorado, I don't think it any longer exists, said you better enjoy life, because if you live to be 50, it'll be a miracle. And Dr. Brown died at about, I think he was 2 or 3.5 months short of 106 when he passed.
Wow.
So
amazing.
He was another one of these fascinating men. When he came back to the U.S., he wanted to be an actor. Kind of a handsome guy, as you can see from the picture. But he told me, they said that he was too old. So he actually lived out in Los Angeles for a while. Became friends with John Wayne and John Wayne's son. Played racquetball against them. Got a picture with he and Miss Jenny Sims, who was a very attractive actress of that time. So he stayed out there for several years, and he played racquetball until his 90s. And then he started to slow down. So when he slowed down, his daughter went and got him, and she brought him back to Southern Illinois, and that's how he ended up getting down to Southern Illinois. And he lived a good, fruitful life. And the last time I saw her, Peg was 88 or 89. I think she had given up the horses, maybe. And she wouldn't take care of him, but she was still running the bed and breakfast. And she said, well, Rick, when are you going to finish that other book so that I can get my father's story? So somewhere down the line, I'm trying to pull another book together at some point, which will have these other stories in there, to include my father's own story as well.
Oh,
so
that's fantastic.
So those are just some of the photos and some of the stories associated with what I'm doing.
Well, I'd love to hear about more of your stack sometime, and maybe sometime when you've got opportunity in the future, Mike and I could travel closer to you, where you don't have to drive so far. And I'd sure like to hear some more about them, Rick. Those are fascinating.
They are.
I mean, I knew we'd be able to hear some good stuff, but Lord, those are like movies, each and every one of themselves. You were right. What do you think it was about that generation? I know Tom Brokaw called that the greatest generation, and what do you think it was about those men that they just didn't talk about that stuff unless they were prompted? I mean, what do you think it was? I know you've had some time to process that.
So I think a couple of things for them, Travis. One was they really understood about sacrifice. One of the gentlemen who I didn't talk about actually went on the Bataan Death March as a partial amputee. And he said, in a sense, we were kind of prepared for this, if you will, because we already understood about sacrifice in adverse conditions. For a lot of them, faith was very prominent in their lives. And I think there was a sense of singularity at that time. I think people pretty much had the idea that there was evil and there was good. And those two were diametrically opposed to each other. So not only were they making sacrifices for their country, but they were making sacrifices for each other as well. And a lot of them came home and just started businesses, continuing professions they had left in order to fight for their country. And they came from all different backgrounds. They came from all different regions. You had the movie stars like the Jimmy Stewarts of the world who signed up. You had the average everyday Joe, if you will, that just came out of the streets. You had people that came from Eastern Kentucky. You had people that came from New York City. So it was really a concerted effort. But I think those are the things that really caused them to be successful, really influence our nation.
That's amazing. I know something you said that those guys, they just didn't brag on themselves. They didn't come back telling all those stories. You know, they almost had to be prompted to even tell you. And several of those that you mentioned, you said I didn't do anything. You know, I was just doing my duty. You know, it wasn't anything special. Well, boy, isn't that something, man? Oh man, that's really neat. Rick, I tell you what, it takes somebody special to go around and gather that kind of information. You say you just hop in a car and go take off and see them, and then sounds like after you got there, the Lord had things put together. I'm sure you were praying as you were going, and God was putting together the details while you were on the way, and boy, you had some fruitful trips, no doubt. Absolutely. It's just neat that you thought enough about those men that you'd gather that information and help their legacy live on, you know, and help keep telling those stories. People need to hear those. I wish there was we need a resurgence today in our day of patriotism and of valor and all those things, you know, where we got, it looks like we're working pretty hard as a nation to tear our nation apart, you know, rather than try to keep it together and put it back together. And we need people to work together and love our country and love, you know what we've put together as a nation. And I think too many of us take it for granted, and I think I have too, no doubt, on many occasions. And I think the older I get, the more I appreciate what people in uniform have done to give us what we enjoy every day that we do take for granted. You know, and I'm sure they spend time on the field. You two guys spend time in service. For people sometimes that you get back home to that aren't grateful for what you've done and what they've done. And, you know, these men put their lives on the line. You all did in service, and some of them literally, and just in the ways that they served. And it's just, what a gift to give to a nation and to a country and to a people, Jesus talked about that, about, you know, you laying down your life for your brother, you know, and you can't give any greater gift than that. And boy, man, those stories are something, brother. I sure appreciate you going and gathering that information. We got to get a hold of that book. Can you give us the name of it again one more time?
Sure. It's called Tribute to Valor and Courage.
Okay, and you're working on a second. Do you have a title, a name for the second one yet?
Right now, I'm working on Legacies of Valor and Courage, which will sort of be a continuation of the first one and the untold stories that I couldn't get all in one edition.
Sure.
There's still, even though we're losing 200 to 400 veterans a day, and I'm talking World War II vets, there's still some around that have stories. So there's several on the docket that I still have to get, and some that I've gotten, and I'm working on getting it in a manuscript. But I've got my real job, so to speak, that I've got to do as well. But this is something that energizes me, and it's definitely a blessing because as I've spoken in different venues, and I have been to schools, I've been to libraries, I've been to bookstores, and sometimes people, the scriptures say people perish for lack of knowledge.
Yes.
Sometimes they just don't know.
Yes, sir.
But as I've shared some of this, people have listened attentively. I remember going to a middle school where there were about 400 kids there. You could basically hear a dime drop. I mean, they were locked in, and some of them came by and said, thank you for this, because as these unfortunate things subsequently have happened in our society, we forget about the sacrifices that people have made to get us to where we are.
Yes, sir.
And when you do go to other countries, you kind of get a barometer of how life can be in third world countries and some other things. And we're pretty fortunate, and we should be thankful for the blessings that we have.
Well, that's the truth. Well, brother, I don't want to wear you out on that. How did you get a hold of some of those pictures, Rick? That had to take a lot of work, just getting a hold of some of that.
Yeah. So what I did is I actually bought a scanner, so I would actually take their personal photos and just scan it into files and upload them. So I probably got 400 to 500 photos.
Wow.
And I've got hundreds of hours of recordings, and I've actually got a website which I can show you gentlemen, a
Sure.
Facebook page where I kind of load information on.
Do you mind giving that out to people?
No, the website is rickslee.net, so that's RICKSLEE.net.
Okay. And you said you have a Facebook page?
The Facebook page is just Rick S. Lee.
Okay.
And just loaded something there recently on an interview that I did with a gentleman who was in a segregated tank unit, not segregated tank, he was a segregated supply unit, but he was at Iwo Jima. And he had a pretty interesting story to tell, too, and ended up becoming a pastor later on in his life.
Wow. Well, on that note, brother, on the spiritual side of things, can you give us some of your testimony about how you came to know the Lord? I've not
Sure.
heard that story.
So I was brought up in a Christian home, and my father for several years was a minister, and I just remember being baptized and accepting the Lord at 12. But as we often do, sometimes I strayed away from him, and in my early 20s, I met this beautiful lady that fortunately became my wife. And little did we know this divine appointment, and we were both kind of walking down this path and seeking him a little more and deeper. And so as I did that, she and I actually met while I was at the University of Alabama. She had already graduated from UAB, and we met together in a reserve unit. And so we became friends, and then I guess I got the bug, and I said, wow, she's kind of cute. And so we became friends, and then eventually we started dating, and we started searching deeper in our faith. And we have grown. We've been fortunate enough to have 4 kids. We've got 2 sons and 2 daughters. But I realize that is what sustains me right now, is faith, and keeps me in these times, because these are uncertain times, and if we depend on just what the world can offer, it's not solid ground. It's not stable.
No, sir, that's a fact. And Rick, I want to thank you for your testimony where I work. Folks, you don't, the place Rick and I work in Louisville, you don't have to be around somebody long to see that they're a person of integrity. And Rick demonstrated that from the time that I first saw him. Just the way he carried himself, the way he conducted himself, a humble fella. You could tell he had a lot to say, but he didn't spend a lot of time saying it. And he, never heard foul language come out of his mouth. He's kind, courteous to those that he was around. And I wasn't surprised to find out when I questioned him a little later before we did this interview that he was a Christian, that he knew the Lord. And I actually had a conversation, I believe, with Mike and my wife, too, beforehand, saying I'd be real surprised if he wasn't, just by the way he conducted himself. And just want to let you know, brother, you're a light. You're a light where you are. And please continue that. We need all of it we can get, and I sure appreciate your testimony for the Lord. And I hope at some point in the future we can get back together and discuss some more of this. Your wife Mary's a wonderful lady. I'm glad I got to meet her today. That was a blessing. And we got to eat some lasagna, my wife's lasagna, and fellowship around some dessert, and then do this interview. And it's been a fantastic afternoon. And we've taken a lot of Rick and Mary's time already. They've got a long drive back to Harrodsburg. And I don't want to keep them out the rest of the afternoon. He cherishes, I'm sure, his weekends. As he said, he's got a real job back in Louisville. And folks, that's something else just to kind of give you the caliber of the man. He's the area leader at work. It's a big responsibility. It's a big job. He's got stuff to do, not only at work, but when he gets home, he's got a family, got 4 kids, 2 boys, 2 girls, got a wife, and responsibilities at home. And he's taking time out of his schedule to drive all the way out of Henry County. Pretty good drive. How far was it, brother, from where you lived out here?
It was about an hour or so, but not bad. Let me just say, Travis, I appreciate the invite, and we're all, as believers, in a bigger service.
Yes, sir.
In a bigger conflict than just what's even happening on this earth. So,
yes, sir.
But it's Him working in us that allows us to do what we do. It's not anything we can do of our fleshly selves. It's just
Absolutely.
Him, and it's an honor and opportunity to be in His service.
Well, appreciate the Lord using you, and you letting Him use you, brother. Really do, and appreciate you coming out and making this drive. And I want to be able to get you back home to do some things that you want to do with your time off, and you've sacrificed a lot of that time to come out here. We'll look forward to getting together. I'm looking forward to just talking to you and fellowshipping in the future, brother. And sure like to come back out closer to you the next time and squeeze some more out of you, some of that information that you got, brother. That's fascinating stuff. Thank you for the time today, brother.
You're welcome. It's been a blessing.
Yes, sir.